Cycles. My name is Julie Klieger. I'm the founder of the Integrated Care Leadership Network. The Integrated Care Leadership Network is a charitable nonprofit. It's a 501c3, and our main focus is on professional leadership development for clinicians and building healthier relationships between clinicians as well as clinicians, patients, and the community in which we serve, and we do this through educational workshops and webinars and things like that. So thank you for joining us today. We're here to talk about the model for improvement and the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle. The model for improvement is a very important model for helping a person with their improvement activities. When you decide to tackle an improvement activity, whether it's large or small, you really need a method or process to help guide your journey. There are a few different models that are all very good models. The model for improvement, which comes out of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, is one we'll be talking about today. Another example of a different model would be Lean or Six Sigma, both very well regarded. We're going to focus on the model for improvement because I find that this is pretty accessible for learning, and it doesn't take any super expertise, and anybody can do it, and it's very practical. So for those reasons, I like it. Foundational to the model for improvement really are these three questions that I'm going to spend a little time now going over. The first question that model for improvement asks us is, what are we trying to accomplish? The answer to that question lies in the aim statement or the SMART goal we have developed for our improvement effort. So for example, an example of an aim statement or a SMART goal would be to improve sepsis mortality from baseline by 50% in 12 months. A different example would be to reduce turnaround times for laboratory specimens from 60 minutes to under 20 minutes, and that improvement will occur within 6 months. So inherent to an aim statement or a SMART goal, it has to be time-bound, meaning how long it will take you, 12 months or 6 months. Having dates is even better. So say from by June of 2014. That's better. That's time-bound. It's got to have measurement in it, so a 50% reduction or going from 60 minutes to 20 minutes so you can measure it. And it has to be realistic. It has to be doable. It could be a stretch goal or aim. That's fine. But those are some of the hallmarks. So that answers the question of what are we trying to accomplish. Sounds very basic, but it's very important to do this at the start of any initiative, small or large. How will we know that a change is an improvement? This is the second question. We know that in order to improve anything, change is required. However, not all change leads to an improvement. You've probably experienced this in your work setting. Not all ideas are going to get you closer to success. That's okay. That's part of improvement work. But you have to know if, in general, over time, you're getting closer and closer to your goal. So that is answered by knowing your baseline data. So where did you start from is very important to know if you're making improvements. So for example, with the sepsis aim statement I gave earlier, we'd have to know our baseline measurement. So we know that. I'm making this up for a hypothetical hospital. So let's say their baseline measurement is 30% mortality for septic patients. So when we say we want to improve that by 50%, we know what 50% means. The lab example there, we knew our baseline measurement was it takes about 60 minutes for turnaround times. So we know that as we do our work, we're getting better moving closer to our goal if we are accomplishing, moving towards our 20%. So how will we know that a change is an improvement? For our goal statements, we need our baseline measurement. This can also be a question you can ask for shorter time horizons. So instead of waiting for the entire project to wrap up, you'll want to know this at the beginning, but you can also develop some intermediate measurement. So how do we want to, what's our measurement for improvement that we want to accomplish within 3 months for sepsis? Maybe we want to imagine that we'll get 10% better in 3 months. So that second question is answered by understanding your baseline measurement. The third question we want to answer that's important to answer is what changes will we make that will result in an improvement? And this is where we'll spend the bulk of our time today, which is discussing the Plan, Do, Study, Act. Because the Plan, Do, Study, Act, also known as a PDSA cycle or a test of change, that's where you take your best guesses for how you think you can shorten, say, turnaround time for laboratory samples or improve sepsis mortality. And this is where you take those guesses, you make them very small incremental changes, guesses, and you put them into this structure of Plan, Do, Study, Act. And that way you can, in an organized fashion, take your best guesses about what will make an improvement, what will lead to a positive change, and you can map that out. So let's talk a little bit more at this time about the Plan, Do, Study, Act. Again, that's where we're going to go into the most detail during this webinar, and I'll talk about each segment of these phases, the plan, the do, the study, and the act. So I talked a little bit about developing an aim. We're not spending much time on that today, but again, an aim statement is very clear. It includes numerical goals and a time goal, like improving sepsis by 50% by October of 2013. So that would be an example of an aim statement. And you want to know an aim statement because, again, as you can see here, what are we trying to accomplish? Everything kind of folds back up to the what are we trying to accomplish? And sometimes in the middle of doing improvement work, we forget what we're trying to accomplish. We get really kind of our heads down in the weeds. So it's important to kind of recollect back up what are we trying to accomplish, because it's also a very unifying statement for all of the people you're trying to sort of talk into doing the change work with you. Why do we test? This is when I say test, I'm using a couple terms interchangeably. That's testing, test of change, and PDSA cycle. So PDSA, again, stands for Plan, Do, Study, Act. So PDSA, testing, test of change, those are all interchangeable. So why test? And the idea of testing, especially small testing, which is the notion of PDSA, is you move from idea to action and you minimize resistance. Because if you think about it, and this is also probably not atypical, again, if you were in a room with me, I would ask you how often this happens in your organization, and that is the big ideas and the big protocols and guidelines and changes in workflow happen, at the director level or the manager's level, and then they're told to the frontline staff. Well, sometimes those ideas that are generated off the unit are not correct. They don't really play out well. They're not the way things are done. They don't take into account differences of shifts or culture or attitudes or the ED versus the ICU. And so you get a lot of resistance. And sometimes just the notion that things were told to us as frontline clinicians to do that we didn't build ourselves, you get resistance. And so when things don't go right, you kind of have lost the hearts and the minds of the people that you want to take along with you to do the change. So there's that element of doing small testing that's derived from those doing the work. But also, if you develop a big policy and you roll it out and it's not right, then you have a big opportunity for failure. And you haven't taken the steps to test and to in fact try something that may or may not work, and if it doesn't work, you're failing on a small level, which is completely new, versus failing on a large level, which takes up a lot of resources. And that way also you can, on small testing, you can also evaluate the question, the effects of change, meaning really to answer the question, did it work or not? Okay, so that's the testing notion. And the guidelines for testing of change, I started to talk about this a little bit, is to fail early and often. This is why one tests on small scale. And probably many of you have heard the question of what can we do by next Tuesday, because the notion of whatever it is we're thinking of doing, regardless of where we are in the week, it should be small enough that we should be able to accomplish it in just a couple days. And you always want to pick willing volunteers. And I know it's another discussion too around how do you identify who's into the idea, who's into the changing of the protocol, say, versus those who are resistant. Do you go after the people who are resistant, or do you try to recruit all the people who are first, your friends? I think the answer is you go with your friends first. You pick the willing volunteers, the people who are also interested in seeing improvement work, and that way you know that there's going to be a number of items that have to be ironed out when you're starting improvement work and change processes. So you might as well do it with people who are open and who aren't going to be terribly judgmental and understand that it's a process of elimination, trial and error. If you pick people who are already on the fence, then and if your change idea doesn't work, which is entirely possible, those people will maybe say, "See, I told you," and it'll be hard to get them back. So you might as well pick them up a little later down the road when you have a couple more successes already under your belt. So here we go into the PDSA. I'm going to have a couple slides to describe PDSA a couple different ways, and that's because in my experience in doing this work, while it seems pretty straightforward, when you're in the middle of it, it sometimes gets a little bit hard just to think through. However, that being said, it is, in my opinion, pretty logical, and we don't want to make it seem more complicated than it really is. There's no reason to overcomplicate something because then people get a little intimidated. They don't want to try it, and then we lose all the benefit of having excitement and interest and creativity in our work, and we want to keep those things at all costs. So the notion of the Plan, Do, Study, Act, and you can see the big words in the blue, and then I put the sort of the tiny little words in blue of my code for what it means to me when I think plan. It's what are we, I'm just going to read the small words first. Plan is what are we doing? Sort of that's we're going on a trip. What are we doing on the trip? Then we're doing the trip, right? Then we're doing the activity. The study is the results. How did it go? And then the act, even though it's a funny word and it seems like it shouldn't be this, it's really what next. So we move from what are we doing, or maybe what are we going to do, to doing it, to thinking about the results of it, and then thinking, well, what did we learn from that, so what are we going to do with that information next? And that's really the Plan, Do, Study, Act. So in the plan, you can see in here, it's the focus on this quadrant I want to highlight, and you can read the bullets yourself, is the prediction. What do we think is going to happen? And again, I'm going to give you specifics in a second of a couple examples. So under the plan, you're really trying to answer a question that you have. Well, what if, let's see, if we think that we want to screen for sepsis patients who come in the emergency department regardless of complaint, because our prediction is it's very difficult to identify those patients who are not full out in septic shock or severely septic. That's where we miss them. So our prediction is it's hard to find these people. So our question that we want to answer is, well, what would happen if we just screened everybody? So the plan might be on one day next week, we're going to screen everybody. The do is the doing. We do that. We evaluate the results of it, and then we determine what worked and what didn't work about that particular test of change, or PDSA. So here's another format for that PDSA. This is a workbook that I've put together. And again, instead of a circle, you see it in this line kind of document, the plan, do, study, act. And these are the questions, if you were to have this workbook, which you are free to have, or this page, these are the questions you'd want to ask as you go along your PDSA. So in the planning, before you do anything, you'd want to be thinking about it is, what's our prediction? Well, we just said that if we keep with the sepsis idea here, that example, well, it's hard to pick up patients who are not completely super sick with sepsis, like severely septic. So we want to catch them early. So our prediction is if we screen them, we can maybe capture them early. So what is to be measured? Good question. Are we measuring how sick people are? No, what we're measuring is, are we screening people? Because we just said our prediction is if we screen people, we will capture more of these patients we might not otherwise pick up. So the test is to screen everybody next Tuesday, maybe on day shift, or maybe for half a day, or from the hours of 9 a.m. to 11 a.m., and we're going to measure how many of these patients get screened, because we said we want 100%. And what's our expected outcome? Well, we don't think we're going to get 100% because, nurses go on break and we get some ambulance patients, and we don't know, maybe people won't know, the nurses won't know where the forms are kept, etc. Okay. So that's a little bit more detailed around how would you plan for that test, and what kinds of questions do you want to anticipate when you set that test up. And then you do it, right? And then you study the results. So let's take this example that I just started. So here we have it, the PDSA to screen patients for systemic inflammatory response syndrome, or, sepsis, pre-sepsis, if you will. I'm just making up that term. So the plan was on one day to screen 100% of all ED patients using this sepsis screen. We'll do it on this date in October. This was something, in fact, that one of the hospitals did that I worked with a couple years ago. So what we saw was, in terms of the PDSA, is we screened most of the patients, but we actually missed a few. And so next Monday we're going to repeat it, and we're going to include the paramedics, because the patients that we missed were the patients who came in via ambulance. So what you can see down at the bottom is the data that we collected, because we knew we wanted to collect data. Remember, we talked about that. So we saw, this hospital ED saw 66 patients on that day during that shift. They screened most of the patients. Okay, they missed 3 of them. So they had a 95% compliance, and when they looked at these data, they realized on that day the people that they missed came in via ambulance. Now, they took it a step further, because they wanted to also see how many of the screens were done correctly. Now, I would say to you that's a second test of change, because you're asking a different question, right? That PDSA cycle is, of those patients we screen, how many do we screen correctly? Different question. Because you could say, well, our prediction is we're not very good at it, because maybe we haven't educated the nurses, or maybe patients already, they're going to have the nurses, the questions aren't clear, or what have you. So that might be 2 different PDSAs. But you could, in fact, do what they did, which is actually determine whether the screen was done correctly. So to summarize a little bit, just on this point, the principles and guidelines for testing. A test of change, again, I'm using that interchangeably with PDSA, should answer a specific question, as we did with wanting to screen 100% of the patients during this particular shift. It should have the prediction, whether we think we're going to be successful in that or not. Again, if we were in the room and somebody wanted to talk out, they would answer the question of, my question to you guys would be, why is it important to have a prediction? Is there anybody on the phone that wants to think about that out loud back to me? This is where webinars are a little tricky, because I know we have a bunch of callers, but I would say that a test of change should have a prediction because you're trying to clarify what it is you're trying to answer. So if you're asking a specific question, you need to have that question in mind, and you need to have a thought about what that answer is, because that also highlights bias that you might have about the performance on your unit, performance of a certain person, say, and those biases can get in the way of how we do our work and how we conduct the PDSA. So you want to have a prediction because you want to uncover whatever biases you might have in that work, because that can be important. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that in a very positive way, because improvement work, this conversation we're having is very technical, meaning here's a tool, let's understand the tool, because using tools is very important in improvement work. But another conversation we could have around improvement work is all of the people factors and the culture of how we do things on this unit, and how you change the way things are done, and how you get people to come along with you, or how you come to understand their needs and change your tactics so that you can really understand their needs and bring them into the equation. That's a different conversation we can have. But when you're doing a prediction, you're starting to think about those other aspects of the improvement process. Other principles and guidelines, again, I've talked a little bit about this so far, and for those of you who are familiar with this kind of work, you know already, you test on a small scale. Because let's say, with that example of screening patients in the emergency department, let's say you said, oh, okay, we're going to do it on all the patients, all the shift, and we're going to make 1,000 copies of this piece of paper because we don't have it in our EMR yet, or EHR yet, and we're going to tell all the nurses and the ward clerks to just put it on all the records. I mean, you can see how quickly that might not go well, especially without proper education around what is sepsis. What's the prevalence? How many of our patients come through with it? What are the signs and symptoms? And what do you do if there's a positive screen? There's so many questions that come up that and you can't anticipate all the questions until you try it on a very small level. Like that last test we just talked about, it would have been hard to have anticipated ahead of time that maybe, for example, for that hospital, ambulance patients are triaged they have a different workflow than those patients who walk in. And walk-in patients, they go through to the triage nurse. Ambulance patients go straight back. There is no triage nurse. So that's a different mechanism, workflow mechanism that one could easily overlook until you test it on a small scale and you pick that up. And when you do testing on a small scale, every time you test something and improve something and build on that same test, like reliability of screening, you're collecting data. And then that means you also have data, quality improvement data, that you can then use to help you understand your statistical analyses of how well you're doing with that data collection and that improvement work. So for those that want to run charts for their improvement work and understand processes as processes and the compliance to processes like screening, or if we're talking about sepsis bundle elements, say of antibiotics within an hour from time of presentation, you're going to want to have data and a lot of different data points so that you can see if your improvement efforts are getting you closer to meeting those process goals or not. And then, of course, every time you do a PDSA cycle, you're learning. You're learning about what works, and you're learning about what doesn't work. And learning about what doesn't work is very important because it makes you more efficient. Because once you learn what doesn't work, you sort of put that one away now, and you don't have to bother yourself with it. And that means then your next time that you're trying a PDSA, you're going to be apt to have greater success because you're starting to eliminate things that aren't working. And then through the process of elimination, you're building a stronger and stronger pipeline for success. And this is an area that I'm always talking about too, which is the normalizing of failure in quotations, because it's not really failure, it's really the normalizing of learning by trial and error. And then, of course, when you test small, like day shift, night shift, weekend shifts, for example, you test under a range of conditions. And I know that not all shifts are created equally, for example, and there is differences of who's working, what they know, what lab services are available, what the staffing patterns are, et cetera. They change. They're just different. And so you can't expect that, the way things operate on Mondays at 11 a.m. are going to be the same as Sundays at 3 p.m. or 3 a.m. So it's just going to be different, and you want to understand that. So moving on. Let me just pause. Are there any questions anybody has? Okay, I'm going to keep going. And I think I've talked about this a fair amount already. I probably keep coming back to it because it's very foundational to PDSA work, which is the starting with oneness. So while I was giving an example of screening patients for sepsis, say, on a day shift, you could do it for 2 hours. I mentioned that as well. You can also start even smaller with one patient. So I'm working with in another setting altogether, which is an outpatient setting, and they're working on reducing their diabetic patients' A1C levels. For anybody whose A1C level is over 8, they want to reduce it by 2 points over the course of 6 to 12 months. There they could start with one patient doing, they're developing as a PDSA, an intake assessment questionnaire. What does the patient know about diabetes? How are they managing the diabetes? What kind of food are they eating? What kind of exercise? What kinds of resources do they have? How well do they understand their diabetes? All that kind of stuff. And so in that set of questions, they need to test that question sheet to see if it makes sense to the patient, if the level of writing is appropriate to the patients that they're caring for, et cetera. And so in that case, you really could start with one patient or one day of patients who come in who are diabetics, and maybe then that day would yield 8 patients. So you can see how you want to understand at a small scale, and it's never too small. And I do have a slide about the difference between research data and quality improvement data, but I'm raising it now because they're different, and because we're doing quality improvement data, we can be looking at numbers that are very, very small and statistically insignificant. That's obviously not the case when you're doing formal research. You need a certain power to your analysis. That's different than what we're doing here. So it's very valid. It may not represent the universe of your patients if you're interviewing one and asking if they understand what's on the form, and you might interview a different patient who understands completely, and the other patient doesn't understand at all. But right there, that also gives you good information, and that helps you as you build to 3 to 5 to more. So the information you get back is, in fact, very valid, even if it's on a small scale of testing. Then eventually you're probably thinking to yourself, well, I don't have all the time in the world. I can't just do onesies, my whole life here. No, of course you can't. But what you're doing, as you can see here in this slide, is you're starting very small at the bottom lower left, and then you're following up. And pretty soon you can, in fact, do that wide scale of implementation. So if we go back to screening, it probably only takes 3 or 4 or 5 tests of change to really make sure that you understand what kind of form you need, what kind of education you need for the nurses, how that information once the nurses fill it in, what's going to happen to it, but how they're going to screen in the first place. You probably only need a couple tests of change to figure out where that form should live, etc., before you then say, okay, we're going to put it out. It's going to go live for all day shift, and then you learn from that, and then the next step can also be equally as large. We're going to now push it out on all night shift or what have you. And so not all the steps are as small, but the first several are very small, and then they get bigger, and then they can be quite wide. So that, see how that goes? Okay, so again, examples of sepsis and screening. You can see here, these are a couple examples from that same hospital of sequential PDSAs, where from left to right, they just start to expand where they're doing the screening, understanding where to keep the screening information, how it's modified Q12, etc. And so this is also nice when you're doing sequential PDSAs, if you have some kind of sheet where you can look at them like this on a piece of paper where they're side by side, so you can kind of capture and not lose that memory of what did we learn, where are we going next, and how do we build on that so we can be as efficient as possible. Let me talk a little bit about the types of testing, because some types really, as you can see here, are stronger, some are weaker. And what I mean by strengths and weakness is the ability to create change and hold that change. So at the very bottom of the be more careful, more vigilant, that's a very weak voltage for change, because it's quite well known in the literature that telling people to work smarter and just to be more careful, of course, if you could be more careful, you would be more careful. I mean, you're doing what you can do. So asking people to just to be more careful is very weak. It's a very weak reminder. So, for example, that's why you see on posted speed signs on roads where it says, we have somebody who put me on hold. As a reminder, do not put me on hold because I'm going to get music like this. Just put me on mute. So anyway, I hope you can still hear me. What I was saying is that for those who, like if you're driving down a road and there's a posted speed sign of 25 miles per hour, that's to some degree a reminder. But if you put in a speed bump, then you're going up this list and you're actually putting in that would actually be a stronger function called a forcing function, where you're forcing people to slow down. So as you go up this page, you can see stronger and stronger tests of change, things that really hold and sustain improvement and change. And it can make sense. You can see it here. Education, very important, but it's not really a change mechanism. It's an education. That change mechanism would be to test before and after and really capitalize on what people learned. Then that's more of a change concept. Rules, policies, etc. The higher up you go on this page, the stronger that kind of improvement work happens. Okay, I hope that person comes back. Oh, okay. You guys can't hear. You can't hear it? Okay, it's just on my end, I think. Then, Let me say a word about improvement versus research. I said this a little bit earlier. Learning and improvement is different than doing research. So learning and improvement, those methods, as I mentioned before, they're observable. It's just enough data. I mentioned that earlier. And you're looking at sequential testing. You are looking at your data as you go along because you are, in fact, trying to change the outcome versus research where you are not trying to change. You're trying to change the outcome, but you don't want to influence the data as you collect it because that would be to bias the data. And you have a fixed hypothesis that you start your research study with, and you don't change it because that's the question you're trying to answer. And really, as it says there, it's really one large test versus every time we do a PDSA.
You have reached a non-working number at Kaiser Permanente in Redwood City. If you feel you've reached this message in error, please call the operator.
I apologize. Somebody, I'm sure
2000.
They're going to hang up in a moment. Okay, so I just like to highlight the difference between learning and improvement and research because sometimes if you're in a room and you're, especially with physicians or PhD individuals who challenge the data, your PDSA data, and which is another reason to have run charts, but you might put those run charts up and talk about processes that you're adjusting and how you're stabilizing them or improving them or reaching goal targets and so forth. And you may have somebody in the room who says, well, gee, that's not real data. That's, can't you see you're working with small n's? You didn't, really randomize the patient population. You're doing different work, and they're both very legitimate work. And what they're talking about is randomized, controlled type data trials, not what we're doing whatsoever. There's a place for that. That's the discovery of new knowledge, or to really challenge existing knowledge. We are doing improvement work, which, as you know, is about workflow changes, implementation of best or better practices, and to observe that in the field in real time. And so this approach is completely regarded as 100% legitimate. That's the difference. For questions that come up with some frequency, who comes up with a test of change? Again, a PDSA or test of change. I'm using those interchangeably. Who comes up with those ideas? And the answer to that is everybody comes up with it, or anybody can come up with it. Again, if we were in a room together or somebody wanted to, respond back to me, I would ask, what improvement work are you engaged in? So what are you doing? What's the problem you're trying to solve, or what's the workflow you're trying to optimize? It could be on discharging patients in a timely way. It could be around core measures, VAP, CLABSI, whatever it is. I would then say, well, what problems are you running into? Well, what are the barriers? What are the goals you're not meeting? And you might say, well, we're having a hard time with following a protocol. Well, okay, so what's an idea you have for trying to improve compliance around that protocol? Or what do you think the barrier is to improving that protocol? And that's where the sort of that 5 whys of why do you think that is and why might that be. If the smaller and smaller you can get in terms of getting tighter and tighter and understanding what you think the challenge is or the issue is, that then becomes your question you want to try to solve. And that becomes your PDSA. And so, or the other way to look at it is you have an idea for improving something. You think, oh, well, if we just did X, then, we would be, in fact, asking patients about their smoking status or their vaccination status. And that smart idea you have is a PDSA, could be a PDSA, especially if it's small enough to be able to be done by next Tuesday, or you take that idea and you just say, well, let's just check it out on the shift I'm working on next week. That's a PDSA. So really anybody can come up with it. How short can it be? I think I've gone over that in some detail. It can be super, super short. It could be an hour. It could be a patient. It could be 3 patients. It could be for staff, because sometimes you want to do improvements or changes in workflow with staff or handoffs between staff. So it can be very short. How long can it be? Again, longer one, I would say that would be an example of something a little longer would be a test of change or a PDSA cycle where you're looking at a new idea of doing a screening tool, say for SEERS, for sepsis, and there the length of that would take a little while to identify a screen you would want to use, and then test it on maybe just the first shift or the first hour of a shift, and then you need to collect those data. So embedded in that work right there is probably a couple, 3 hours of work, maybe less, depending on how small it goes. But again, you don't want it longer than what you're going to be able to manage, and certainly no longer than what you and maybe hopefully somebody else or a couple of you can get done in just a few hours over the course of the week. How do you know which change worked if you test more than one idea at a time? Sort of if you go back to that screening tool, right, for sepsis and the ED, and people trying to ask or trying to answer the question of, okay, we want to screen patients. We want to make sure that the nurses are doing it correctly, and they're doing it correctly on those patients who are in fact severely septic. Too many questions in there, because how will you know? Especially if you try to run one test that answers all those questions and you don't have mechanisms to divide out your findings, then it will become messy. And that's, I think, the other reason of trying to answer some of those questions on that logbook or the activity logbook for the PDSA is if you can answer those questions of what's our prediction, what's the question we're asking, what data do we need to collect, that forces you really just to test one idea at a time. Because very quickly you'll see, or the conversation you have amongst a couple of you will be, if you're raising several questions at once, somebody in that room is going to say, well, I think we're talking about more than one idea. We're talking about the accuracy of the screening versus the compliance to screening. So, again, the reason why you really want to try to just do one thing at a time as much as possible. And if we were in a room or for somebody who wants to ask me questions, now is the time for your questions, because I think really, with the exception of one or two more slides, I'm at the end. Well, let me finish up, and I think we also have contact information, so you can always ask questions in another way. So here's a sheet. As you may have something like this. This was adapted off of the IHI's worksheet, so you can find these kinds of worksheets quite commonly. But I think especially when you are with others and you're trying to figure out what you're going to do, it's nice to have a tool. So here's a tool that you can use. It's just a Word document. You can see here it's the PDSA. And then along with this, which I'll just say a word about, but again, it's a different conversation. We can have a webinar on how do you communicate and your improvement work to others, and how might you create a message map to target your audience for specific tests of change or PDSA cycles. Because as I mentioned very early on, a big part of improvement work is in encouraging others to understand the work, getting others to share their opinions and their thoughts and get them to participate. And so thinking about what is it you're doing, why are you doing it, and how it benefits them is really important as you think about the improvement activity itself. So you'll see that on this sheet also, but that enters into this conversation around strategic messaging, which I have found to be extremely helpful when doing improvement work. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. We had a nice group, and I look forward to hearing back from you from your polling. And again, send me any information or feedback or thoughts about new webinars or additional webinars that you'd like to hear about, and we'll try to put them together. Again, you can reach me at Julie, Julie, at myicln.org. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a nice afternoon.